settle. Thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we can give our presenters as much time as possible. I know you want to hear from them. My name is Priscilla O'Shin. I am a proud alumni of UCLA, CRS. Hey, Addie, how you doing? I see many others. Good to see you. Look at some familiar faces. Can I go in the house? Okay, I see you. I'm really pleased to be the least important person on this panel, the moderator, to introduce this topic, which is policing, punishment, and the carceral state. And for those of us who have been living in the United States, pretty much my whole life, but especially this last year, especially in Los Angeles, carcerality has been very present. We have had ICE raids. We have had National Guard deployments. We see police in our schools. We see police pretty much in the hospital, wherever you go, right? We see logics of punishment and discipline infused in nearly all of our institutions. And I think you'll hear from our panelists just how extensive this notion of carceral creep permeates basic existence, right? And even non-human existence, and the way that we think about sentience and sentient beings. So I'm gonna briefly introduce our panelists, just their names, titles. You can get additional information about them in the program. We are going to proceed from my right to my left, starting with Niala Tringali Carbato, who is an incoming associate at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, and also a child of CRS. Has been in the building a very long time. Very proud of all that they've done over time, and it's so wonderful to see you here as a lawyer presenting this wonderful paper. Niala will present a paper on anti-carceral human rights, avoiding the pitfalls of carceral feminism. Then we'll hear from Frank Rudy Cooper, who is a professor of law and the director of the program on race, gender, and policing at the Boyd School of Law at UNLV. Then we will hear from Raymond, who will, Magasese, who is an incoming associate at Houston and Hennigan, who will talk about the sentencing the model minority to death, the Asian American lacuna in the fight against California's death penalty, and last but not least, we'll hear from Michael Ulrich, who is an associate professor at Boston University School of Public Health and School of Law on arms and race. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Niala. I use they, them pronouns, and I will be discussing anti-carceral animal rights. So I'll go over kind of a basic roadmap. I'll begin by discussing the emergence of the modern animal rights movement. I'll then shift over to carceral animal rights and why that shift began. After that, I'll provide some examples of alternative approaches to animal rights that really kind of take seriously changing the status of animals in our society. And then I'll end by providing just a list of recommended literature in case you want to learn more, and by showing a clip from the documentary The Smell of Money, which goes into this in a lot more depth. So the modern animal rights movement really began in the 70s, and it was very structurally oriented. So this meant it was focused on zoos, on circuses, on factory farms, ending animal experimentation, and those types of structural issues. And the goal of this movement was really to change the status of animals in our society, and they took a very philosophical approach to this. So this meant asking questions such as, what does it mean to be sentient? What is our moral obligation towards living beings? And applying the logic of philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, who asked questions like, the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Then by the 2000s, there was a shift towards carceral animal rights. And this approach essentially parallels carceral feminism. And many of you likely know carceral feminism is an approach to gender-based violence that relies heavily on police and prison systems. And while I don't have time to go into depth about carceral feminism, the basic critique is that carceral feminism fails to prevent harm or address root causes of harm and serves instead as a reaction to violence after the fact. And similarly, carceral animal rights relies on prisons and policing to end violence against animals. And over the years, more and more animal rights activists have begun partnerships with police departments, with prosecutors' offices, attempting to target more individuals rather than these larger structures and systems. And this approach essentially just takes on the bad actor framework, which means rather than looking at these zoos, circuses, factory farms, people are targeting the person who neglected their cat, who hurt their dog, and these are all bad things, but this isn't where a vast number of animals are being harmed, and focusing on that doesn't actually change the way that we see animals in our society. So the critique of carceral animal rights kind of parallels the CRT critique of the perpetrator perspective, which also looks at bad actors and the individual bad person rather than attacking the systems of racism that kind of enable it, and that does little to change the status of animals. So the question then becomes, why should we focus on the structural rather than the individual? And my focus here is on factory farms. Factory farms are the perfect example because of the way it intersects with so many different issues. And so the bulk of this presentation will kind of cover this. So I want to start by having you all picture a farm with grass-fed cows and free-range chicken. You might have a very, idyllic image of cows roaming around, friends with other animals, by a lake, by a stream, and maybe if not so idyllic, maybe you just see chickens with enough room to walk around, some fresh air, sunlight, cows on some lush fields, being able to be with other similarly content cows. But the truth is that that is far from the reality of farms, even the ones that claim to be the more humane farms. And the next images I'm going to show are a little bit graphic. I didn't pick the most graphic ones, but I do think it's important to see what is really happening on factory farms. And so the truth is that free-range chickens are kept inside barns their entire lives. They never see light, sunlight. They are plagued by diseases and infections. They're forced to trample over their dead. They're bred in ways that often leave them unable to even walk. Cows, even when they begin their lives on grass fields, are then moved to feedlots, and they're confined in small spaces and have limited ability to roam. When they're relocated, they're kicked and dragged, hung by chains to get them to move to the locations that the farmers want them to be. Dairy cows are forcibly impregnated. They have their babies immediately taken from them. They're milked often to the point of bleeding, infection, and then they're forcibly impregnated again, and the cycle continues until they're no longer able to give birth or they die. So during this entire process, they're chained up, they can't walk more than a few feet, they can't socialize with other animals. And to really understand what is going on, I put together a short video that basically uses the audio from factory farms where they claim to be humane, they claim to be caring for the animals, and I overlay it with images from undercover investigations of factory farms where we see what's really happening on these farms.
The best word I can use in describing our relationship with Tyson is we feel we have a key partnership. We work hand in hand. It's our jobs from conception to get that animal to market and to do that as efficiently and the best quality and the safest way we possibly can. Together, we form a great team.
Everything is tracked. Planning and documenting every stage of production to assure that we're taking care of the environment, we're going to leave it in a better way than we found it, and to provide our customer with a wholesome product that they know is safe and can be traced to the genetics that made up the animal.
Caring for the birds, we walk through the houses, we watch lighting conditions, we watch our air quality, we watch humidity levels to keep the floors in good shape for the birds. All of those things work together to provide the best bird that we can provide.
More and more people want to know what they're going to eat. We care about those concerns and we address them head on. We want to go to bed at night knowing that we're doing our level best, taking care of our cows and taking care of people.
So again, I know those images can be very graphic, but I do think it's important to know the truth. And it's because of this truth that it's important to focus not on these individual bad actors, but on these institutions like factory farms and the corporations behind factory farms. If we don't, we risk essentially failing the vast number of animals who are harmed in the United States and around the world. So if people really care about animal rights and about animal welfare, then this should be the focus. Another reason that we should be focused on the structural is that this gives the animal rights movement the ability to kind of coalition build and create solidarity with other movements. Most social justice movements are shifting away from punishment and the carceral state to address systemic issues, and by distancing ourselves from policing and prisons, we give ourselves the opportunity to make meaningful collaborations. And we can see this across a number of different movements. So with environmental rights movements, factory farms are one of the worst things to happen to our planet. Right after fossil fuels, it is the leading cause of climate change. So if you care about environmental issues, factory farms should be at the forefront of your activism. Workers' rights issues are also implicated. Working on factory farms are consistently ranked as some of the worst working conditions. Workers are constantly injured. They are experiencing trauma, psychological harm, from having to torture and kill sentient beings. It's a traumatic experience, and if you listen to any of the stories from factory farm workers, you really hear what's going on and how horrible it can be. And lastly, with racial justice movements, there are a number of different reasons, but one is that factory farms pollute the neighboring areas to an extreme extent. And when they're polluting, this means that the neighboring areas have no access to clean water, to clean air. They're basically at higher risks of having cancer, respiratory illness, and other issues. And who's living in these areas? Predominantly people of color and marginalized communities. So by taking seriously these intersections, animal rights activists can form these types of coalitions and work on addressing human harm and animal harm together. The last reason the animal rights movement should shift away from carceral animal rights is these institutions are not on our side. Animal ag controls factory farm laws through customary practice exceptions, which basically means that things that would ordinarily be considered abuse on factory farms are not if they are deemed to be a customary farm practice, which is essentially anything that happens on factory farms. The government also actively targets animal rights activists, and especially in the 2000s, the FBI began labeling animal rights organizations and activists as terrorists and as the #1 threat to the United States. And we're not just talking about people who are like breaking into facilities and taking animals. Even mainstream organizations like PETA, like student-run organizations that are focused on veganism and coalition building are targeted by the FBI. The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is the perfect example of this. This act essentially prohibits damaging or interfering with the operations of an animal enterprise. And the issue with this law, among other things, is that it's overly broad, and so essentially any form of protest, nonviolent action can be viewed as interfering with animal agriculture or an animal enterprise. Lastly, many states have passed ag-gag laws, which are essentially laws that prevent whistleblowers from speaking out about what's happening on factory farms. So if someone wants to expose the harms and the conditions, they are targeted. And many states have viewed this as unconstitutional, of course, but many more are trying to pass laws now that are essentially other versions of ag-gag laws. So to wrap up, there are many approaches to animal rights that don't rely heavily on prisons and on policing. Even if we want to focus on companion animals, we can do that in other ways, like focusing on ending bans that target specific breeds, like pit bulls, But generally the focus should remain on these larger structures, the zoos, factory farms, trying to establish legal personhood for animals, creating or trying to enact better laws that are structurally oriented, all of those things. And to do this, we can even look to CRT frameworks, applying frameworks such as intersectionality, interest convergence theory, looking to the bottom. All of that can be applied to animal rights activism and work. So with that, I have a few pieces of literature if anyone's interested in learning more about these issues, and this short clip for The Smell of Money, which I recommend everybody watch.
They are poisoning our soil, poisoning our groundwater, poisoning people, fellow Americans. They are stealing from them in the present and stealing from future generations.
If it does not touch you in an emotional way, if you really get in to look at this issue, whether it's from an environmental standpoint, an animal rights issue, whether it's a human rights issue, whether it's an antibiotic use issue, if you can walk away from this saying, no big deal, you need to come talk to me. Let me take you for 3 days and let you sit down and talk to these people who have to live with this every day. Matter of fact, let me let you live in their shoes for a day and see if it doesn't change your mind.
No, and ain't nobody helping us do nothing. They don't care because we black. We back up in the country. I just hope my house don't get burned up tonight from top of the year. Because I'm sure he's somewhere peeping now. You can believe that. He got his boys on you.
What makes you think you have a right to set up a hog farm and destroy my way of life? People don't have access to clean air and clean water anymore.
One of the most disturbing stories that I've heard is the sensation of being sprayed with shit, basically.
I have seen this stream filled with feces and urine from this hog operation right up here more than one time.
Almost every fish in the river died. Over 1 billion fish died in a period of about a week and a half.
Everyone that's on this road got a health fate. Every one of us, trust me.
Our health is at stake here. To raise animals in this way puts all of us at risk.
It is time that the village stand up, step up, and speak up.
If these people had lived in McMansions, it would have been a different story.
It's the power to control. That's what drives man to the end of sanity.
All the laws protect these industries. No one is protecting us.
So with that, the bottom line is that thinking about animal rights as a structural issue allows us to not only respect the dignity and lives of animals, but it allows us to address almost all the fundamental issues in society that we care about, from workers' rights issues to racial justice issues to environmental issues and more. Thank you.
So I am so honored to be on a panel with two first-time presenters, Niala and Raymond. The future is so bright. So, good afternoon. I'm pleased to be among all these great crits. I am really looking forward to your comments on this work in progress. And of the many people I know in the audience who have been helpful to me, I want to thank specifically Daryl and Eric for helping with this project, although they bear no responsibility for where it is right now. So we are on a tight timeline, so I'm going to tell you my roadmap in case I cut myself off when I see the 15-minute mark. So I'm going to read a key portion of my current abstract. I'm going to briefly discuss my topics and the scholarly context for this piece. I'm going to summarize the rise and fall of broken windows theory. And I'm going to discuss the emergence and principles behind hotspots policing theory. So that's the main thing I'm going to do, and then time permitting, I'm going to start to talk about the implications of what I'm calling a preservation through transformation of the move from broken windows policing to hotspots policing. All right, so here's the abstract. In the 2000s and 2010s, legal scholars and the courts panned broken windows policing's manifestation as programmatic stop, question, and frisk on grounds that it targeted young Black and Latino males in impoverished communities. One might think that criminology's current trend of instead advocating for focusing police resources based on the locations of crime hotspots would make policing more legitimate. This is the first article to, I have to say that, you know. This is the first article to comprehensively demonstrate that hotspots policing's hyper-targeting by location still enforces racial and ethnic hierarchy. To understand this problem, this article looks to constitutional theory, not to critique Fourth Amendment doctrine, but to understand the practices of the institution of policing. The preservation through transformation thesis posits that sometimes a subordinating practice is changed, but essentially survives in a new form. Such is occurring in the transition from broken windows policing to hotspots policing because it still targets young Black and Latino men in impoverished urban areas, just with the veneer of colorblindness. Hotspots policing is colorblind in that it ignores the predictability of racial disparities when police hyper-target high crime areas. This adds to our understanding of colorblindness by revealing its, one, inattention to how race and ethnicity affect perceptions of crime, and two, rationalization of racial and ethnic disparities as resulting from other phenomena. The article thus reveals colorblindness to be the mechanism by which the transition from broken windows policing theory to hotspots policing theory continues to rely upon police, racial, and ethnic targeting. All right, so part two of this presentation. I want to talk about what is the topic here, right? Basically, what I'm trying to do is look at an intersection of the critique of colorblindness and a critique of criminological theories of what is the best practice for policing. So that's the intersection colorblindness and criminological theory. And then the other thing that I'm doing is looking at the transformation from broken windows policing theory as predominant to hotspots policing as predominant. That's my topic. Scholarly context. A lot of precursors. Among them, the critique of colorblindness in Fourth Amendment doctrine. We know some people who have done that, and they include also Daniel Harawa's recent award-winning piece. Secondly, understanding criminological theories of policing, and Eric Miller has done a lot of good work on what do the criminologists think is policing, good policing, and there's a whole history of the continual reform of policing. And then third, a critique of criminologists' biases. And Osagie Obasogie and colleagues, Douglas Brahman and colleagues have talked about how criminology has a tendency, if not a tradition, towards sort of papering over racial bias. All right, so the theoretical framework is Reva Siegel's preservation through transformation theory. Basically, she talks about, in a couple of articles, and then Kyle Velpe and some others have written about this as well. You take something like the right of chastisement, right? I, as a man, can beat my wife, but only with, a stick about this why. Otherwise, it violates the law. So then they got rid of the right of chastisement, and what happened? We still have abuse of wives in this case, but with the veneer that it's been reformed and that it's changed. The practice is transformed, or a reform transforms something, but the subordination still continues. And that's what I'm trying to apply here. So the third part of this is to talk about the fall of broken windows theory, because broken windows theory is what I'm arguing is being transformed into hotspots policing theory, but is maintaining the subordinating practice of targeting young, urban, Black and Latino males. So broken windows theory in a nutshell says that police should focus resources on stopping low-level disorder as a means of preventing crime. The central thesis is that disorder leads to higher crimes. And I could talk a little bit more about disorder. The way that we've seen this, or that it's been most critiqued, is in the city that became safe, right? New York City, which had Mayor Giuliani and Commissioner Bratton adopt various practices that were sort of undergirded by the broken windows policing theory, but most famously programmatic stop and frisk, where they did millions of stops, almost always of young Black or Latino males in New York City, and trying to use pretextual stops for quality of life offenses, which means you were doing some shit nobody cared about and that they didn't use to police, but now they've targeted your neighborhood and they're stopping all the young Black and Latino males. All right, so that's sort of how broken windows theory cashed out. The theory, though, I think was well debunked by, among others, Bernard Harcourt, who a lot of people have heard his critique of broken windows theory, that it's not really true that there's this disorder to high crime connection. But there's a less known article which I think really gets at the heart of the problem. So there's a guy, I think it's William, I apologize, it's not in my notes right now, Rowan, who was a criminologist and is now an independent scholar. And he talks about the fact that this is the theory that wasn't there, right? The theory was said in the famous Broken Windows article that if you let windows be broken, and here the windows are little petty crimes that we usually don't care about, that will cause disorder and that will cause greater crime. But Rowan points out that, in fact, every time you pressed on Wilson and Kelling and others, they would say, well, we're not saying that disorder causes crime. We're saying that maybe there's some relationship. And then they'd say, and even if there is no relationship between disorder and crime, it's probably good for communities anyways to just get rid of disorder. So it's the theory that wasn't there. Luckily, or rather because people organized and fought the NYPD stop and frisk program, a federal district court under Judge Shira Scheidlin of the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of New York found that the New York NYPD's programmatic stop and frisk program violated both the Fourth Amendment because there were all these unconstitutional stops, and then also violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause because they had a policy, and the policy was stop the right people. And they were able to demonstrate that the policy was in fact stop young, Black, African American, and Latino males in these particular precincts. All right, so let's talk about the emergence of hotspots policing theory. So broken windows theory was all the rage, right, for like 3 decades. Now what's coming is the idea that hotspots policing fixes that. So hotspots policing, I'm gonna talk a little bit about its principles, and I'm just gonna posit, essentially, that it has emerged as a predominant theory now for policing. There's a group of theories. One of them is procedural justice theory, which a lot of people will be familiar with. But hotspots policing seems to be the way that a lot of police departments are operating right now. So there are 4 principles that I identify from hotspots policing. One is the law of concentration, created by David Weisberg in conjunction with Larry Sherman and Anthony Braga, a couple of other criminologists. And the law is that a small number of micro units produce the biggest share of crime problems in urban areas. So I left out an important switch. The reason that we would think that it's better to go to hotspots policing is that they say what we're concentrating on is the locations, and just little locations where there's hotspots of crime. We're no longer saying the entire west side of Las Vegas, the entire east side of Las Vegas is a high crime area, and we're gonna flood the zone and stop everybody in that area. Instead, we say a block, a park, an address, and most importantly, certain people who we think might be gang members ought to be targeted. And in theory, that's better, right? We don't take the whole neighborhood and say they're criminals. We just say these few locations and these few people are the people that we're gonna criminalize. That's the law of concentration. So it leads to hyper-targeting. And I just wanna talk a little bit about this. Some people refer to mass incarceration resulting from police racial and ethnic profiling through pretextual intrusions as the new Jim Crow. But sociologists of crime and poverty Loic Wacont refers to it as hyper-incarceration. Wacont argues there is nothing mass about this incarceration as it is hyper-focused on a particular group, young Black and Latino males in poor urban neighborhoods. So this talk argues for a similar recognition that hotspots policing is not just concentrated policing, but is hyper-focused on young Black and Latino males in poor urban neighborhoods. So there's another prong, there's actually two other prongs, but the last principle that I want to talk about is a sort of subterranean principle of color blindness. And here I'll talk a little specifically. In the face of assertions that hotspots policing is biased, concentrated policing theorists suggest that a purported lack of community resentment stems from an awareness that the targets are appropriate. Anthony Braga thus asserts, in the eyes of the community members, there's an inherent fairness in offering targeted offenders a chance and providing resources to support their transition away from, rather than simply arresting and prosecuting them. Putting aside whether the communities hyper-targeted by policing actually agree with Braga about the lack of need to accord former criminals due process's presumption of innocence, this statement reveals a hidden feature of hotspots policing, its commitment to color blindness. Knowing that police using hotspots policing theory are concentrating on young Black and Latino males in poor neighborhoods, Braga latches onto location and prior criminality as facially neutral bases for hyper-targeting. And I'm using knowing here in the criminal law and some other mens rea sort of way, right? They are aware that this is what is happening and they don't care. It's above recklessness because they have a practical certainty of what the result of these practices is going to be. So the argument mostly, or what I'm trying to show, is this transition from broken windows policing theory to hotspots policing theory still just is a transformation that preserves racial and ethnic targeting. I have 30 seconds. I'll end by just saying this. This is still hyper-targeting the usual suspects. You may recall Anthony Thompson's famous article about stopping the usual suspects. We're still going after the usual suspects, and just like in the movie, we're gonna lose.
I'll just say, I just watched The Usual Suspects, so I only just now get that reference. Kaiser Sose. Raymond, will next turn to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raymond Magsaysay. I just wanted to say also it's an absolute honor for me to be here. Critical race theory, it's been an incredible experience to kind of hear and be here with intellectual idols and inspirations who have always taught me to kind of ask and explore unquestioned answers and to kind of explore unanswered questions and unimagined questions. And so before I begin, I wanted to kind of, in the spirit of critical race theory, provide a little bit of background, given critical race theory's emphasis on positionality and storytelling. So my scholarship thus far, and I'll make a plug for it, bit.ly/AAPI-abolition, if you're interested. my scholarship has really focused on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and their exclusion from conversations, including very critical ones, of the criminal system. And so I kind of staged my intervention and asked, where are Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in conversations about criminal justice or injustice, or in the criminal penal system? And so this current article that I'm working on is kind of an evolution of that. And so my interest in this area really stems from my experiences in my back at my neoliberal arts college, where I often heard people talking about poverty really passionately and sincerely, I think. But they always talked about poverty as if poor people like myself or my family weren't in the room. And that was really an incredibly alienating experience and silencing experience. And it wasn't until critical race theory kind of empowered me to put value and put stock in my own lived experience as part of that community. And ultimately kind of teach me that I do have something to say and that lived experience is valuable. And it is a site of knowledge production and of a lot of generative power. And so as I kind of delve more into critical race theory and embrace its tenets, particularly intersectionality, I perceive it as more as, yes, it is about overlapping identities, but also about interconnectedness and how our liberations are truly, truly connected with each other. And so that's kind of where my scholarship really sees. I see our liberations of the Asian American community as intrinsically tied to the liberation of other communities. And so delving into my scholarship now, my current project is entitled Sentencing the Model Minority to Death, the Asian American Lacuna in the Fight Against California's Death Penalty. So as some of you may know, there was a pretty significant direct challenge to California's death penalty filed last year. It was a petition for a writ of mandate and under the California Supreme Court's direct and original jurisdiction. It was a petition for a writ of mandate, basically telling the California Supreme Court that the death penalty as administered is racist at every stage. The claim, that was really the claim. It was a pretty straightforward claim. And the petition is quite remarkable. It's really an extraordinary petition, and I highly recommend everybody to look it up and read it. It marshals 15 incredible empirical studies over 40 years, saying that it really is racist at every single stage, from charging to jury selection to prosecutorial discretion. And additionally, it kind of synthesizes state consensus. It cites statements from Governor Gavin Newsom, the state attorney general, even previous justices of the state Supreme Court, all of these government actors saying that the death penalty is racist, right? And I think everybody here would agree that it is, right? And another kind of remarkable part of this petition is that it seeks relief only under the state constitution. It specifically says we are not seeking relief under the federal constitution. And in this way, it really echoes the California legislature's recent pronouncement and rejection of McCleskey versus Kemp, right? And it's really saying we don't care whether or not there's intentional invidious discrimination, but we do care that there is disparate impact and that racial disparities plague the entire system. And so what we have in the petition is this incredibly race conscious, and I should also say that the petition infuses and uses a lot of really critical scholarship, including incredible critical race scholarship in the petition. Yet despite all of its rigor and attentiveness to race, a lot of different racial groups, Native Americans, Asian Americans, which is my focus, is nowhere to be found. Not in any of the studies over 40 years, not in any footnote. There's no mention of criminalized Asian Americans at all. And so that kind of begs the question of, and this is, I think, something that we often see in criminal, in both mainstream and criminal discourse on criminal penal system, right? And so the question is is it because Asian American capital defendants do not exist? Are condemned Asian Americans not impacted by racism? Is it because they're too few in number to matter? Is it because Was it a strategic choice, perhaps? Would their inclusion maybe have diluted focus on populations most directly impacted by the death penalty? Or maybe they just simply don't matter, right? Particularly, at least maybe for the purposes of the petition. And so my paper kind of tries to explore these questions. And it identifies and addresses this Asian American lacuna, as I term it. And my goal is to really bolster the petition's efforts to expose the intrinsic illegality and immorality of the petition, of the California's death penalty scheme as intrinsically racist, right? And the goal is to really foster a collective and stronger challenge to it. And I do want to highlight that the point is to not discredit the petition. I think all of us would agree that I hope this petition succeeds. And I also want to say that I clerked at the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court has unfortunately found extraordinary ways to not rule on this. They've delayed and delayed and delayed, and they're really trying all they can to not rule on it because it's an extremely compelling petition. And so we'll see where it goes. But to anyone interested, we can talk about that at a separate point. But my point is that the erasure of criminalized Asian Americans in the petition, and more broadly in discussions around crime, has severe practical and theoretical implications. And I actually argue that if we actually include them, right, these implications, if we address these implications and these challenges, they actually yield critical insights that are going to be very, very helpful in efforts to actually abolish the death penalty and to actually dismantle racial injustice more broadly. And so put more simply, including Asian Americans in our analysis shows us the full scope of white supremacy, right? How it actually functions both on a macro, micro, institutional, and ideological and interpersonal level. And so I wanted to kind of echo words of Professor Angela Davis in Our Prisons Obsolete. She has a passage, I'll just read it, quote, "There are other racialized histories that have affected the development of the US punishment system as well. The histories of Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. These racisms also congeal and combine in the prison. Because we are so accustomed to talking about race in terms of black and white, we often fail to recognize and contest other expressions of racism." And so that's really kind of where I'm coming from to address this problem. And so the analysis of my paper proceeds in 5 parts. I first set the stage by detailing and disrupting, as many of you are probably aware, of the model minority public identity of Asian Americans, right? And the model minority myth suggests that Asian Americans are profoundly successful, wealthy, prosperous, high educational attainment, and that's partly because, according to the myth, because they're innately diligent, they have incredible work ethic, they have incredible family values, right? And that they're law-abiding. So I traced the model minority myth, its origins, right, and how it was really manufactured and stems from 2 articles in the 1960s, a year after the Moynihan Report. And famously, of course, the Moynihan Report blames inequality, black inequality, to black cultural mores, supposedly. And so by tracing that history, we kind of see that the model minority myth is an intrinsically anti-black project, right? And so I kind of explain in detail how the model minority really functions as a divide and conquer tool of white supremacy. Implicit in the narrative is that you have this group of minorities, Asians, who are excelling on their own without having to demand rights during the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, we have, quote unquote, these problem minorities who are demanding rights and who are committing crime, right? Oh, okay, wow, time goes by. And so, okay. And beyond that as well, you know, there's a lot of other problems with the model minority myth is that it also it erases kind of the actual struggles that a lot of Asian Americans experience, including, as I kind of made clear in my previous work. For example, the incarceration rates of Asian Americans actually quadrupled over the past time period, and nobody really kind of talks about that, right? And even among critical scholars, there's kind of a discomfort in talking about Asian Americans, and to the extent that we talk about Pacific Islanders at all, there's kind of a discomfort around talking about that as if they are not minorities, right? Which often kind of paints them in proximate to whiteness, right? And as critical race theorists, I do figure, and I want us to kind of challenge, what are the implications of that? Are we kind of falling into this trap, this anti-Black trap of model minority myth, wherein, you know, Asian Americans are cast as this perpetual other, you know, placed on pedestals as kind of exemplars of post-racial progress, right? That's used as a master's tool to chastise other minority groups who are not sufficiently self-reliant, right? In any case, you know, I talk about the petition and kind of detail the incredible studies they rely on. And it's not really the petition's fault, probably, for not mentioning Asian Americans. None of the studies actually do. You know, to the extent they look at all the populations, none of them really address Asian American defendants at all. And then third, I kind of discuss more of the consequences of really excluding them, right? And so, and then I kind of concretize I concretize the theory by looking to two capital cases, People versus Hin and People versus Mao. They're both capital cases wherein I actually show how prosecutors in California, by looking at the trial transcripts, the way that they've been able to sentence a lot of Asian American defendants in California is by really painting these Asian American capital defendants as not the model minority myth, but actually painting them towards closer to Black stereotypes. Right? For example, in Hin's case, the prosecutor actually said, look, Hin's family is exceptional. These are Cambodian immigrants who value education. All his siblings finished high school, very valued education. His sister actually finished high school in 2 years or 3 years. And instead, Hin likes rap music, really loves Black culture, and talks about all of these things in the record. And in fact, he looks Black in the record. And in fact, people ask if he's half Black. And that's all in the record and all the juries. So we have prosecutors quite literally trying to paint Asian American capital defendants as not the model minority, but are instead proximate to Blackness. And in Chun's case, in the other capital case, we have prosecutors actually presenting photos to the jury, darkened photos of the defendant. And again, contrasting them to their family, who are exceptional Buddhists, quote unquote, who are very diligent and quiet, right? And so we see a mobilization of the model and minority myth on multiple levels to kind of drive the prosecution to get death verdicts, especially in the penalty phase, right? And so as we're kind of contemplating the capital scheme and just how fundamentally anti-Black and racist it is, I think looking at and and including this dimension in our analysis, and and especially in the petition's analysis, we can see in the works of Professor Angela Davis just how anti-Asian racism actually congeals with anti-Blackness to prop up the entire scheme that is so fundamentally racist. And I do think that by doing that, we kind of gain a fuller picture of white supremacy and how it functions on multiple levels. And so I think I end the paper with a call to action. I urge racial justice lawyers to embrace the radical imaginative vision and spirit of critical race theory. To use data for sure, but to also center storytelling, right? By looking at the stories of people like Hin and people like Chun, and to reclaim law as both a side of critique and creation, right? And to also remember that I think all the plenaries have kind of spoken to this, that law is simply a tool, right? I really hope the petition succeeds, but even abolishing the death penalty legally is not going to abolish the capital mentalities that we have, our punitive instincts, right? And so I think our challenge is to create and abolish those as well in our own daily practices. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to first say how grateful and honored I am to be here. I haven't been this excited to attend a conference in a long time. So my work is at the intersection of constitutional law and public health and using a social justice lens, which usually means I go to con law events and kind of annoy them by talking about peer-reviewed articles, and then go to research conferences and annoy them by bringing up legal questions. But my work in the Second Amendment space has really kind of brought these two together in a way that felt absolutely necessary, right? If you ever want to have an understanding of the problem with the Second Amendment's current jurisprudence, try to explain to a room full of students how whether or not an AR-15 is protected is tied to the Statute of Northampton from 1328. Right, like they just don't understand at all, and the public wouldn't, right? Why would a statute from the 1300s in England have any bearing on the United States' incredibly unique and tragic issue of gun violence? And so in the other direction, right, in the most recent Second Amendment case, United States versus Rahimi, which is about the federal prohibition on possession of firearms for those who are under domestic violence restraining order, you had people who were saying, making the arguments as to why it was a constitutional and valid law, going back and saying, well, look, at the founding, the government prohibited entire groups of people, right? Native Americans, black people, and therefore that can be analogized to today where we can disarm dangerous people, right? So you have proponents of gun safety measures trying to use slavery, for example, right, the disarmament of Native Americans and the genocide as a way to justify, right? And so it's just this bizarre space that, frankly, I always kind of hated being in. And so I wanted to find other ways to think about it, and public health research and data and empirics was the way in for me. But my most recent paper on the topic after Rahimi, myself and Daniel Marawa were asked to write an exchange for the Yale Law Journal Forum, where I think, unfortunately, the journal wanted us to argue and disagree more, but we already knew each other and liked each other. And so what it really turned into was Daniel really looked at race and the way that race was used before Rahimi and in Rahimi, and I was looking at the way that gender was used before and in Rahimi. And so both are used to justify expansive views of Second Amendment rights, right? So you have these sort of anecdotal stories of women in danger and they're saved by an armed person, typically a man, right? You have these stories of pre-Civil War and post-Civil War and Reconstruction about black people being disarmed and how that was this significant problem, and that's why it's so important today. And then you have Rahimi, right, this issue again about domestic violence and the criminal consequences of violating the federal law, and race is not discussed, gender is not discussed at all in any way, right? So both of them just sort of disappear all of a sudden, right? And so Daniel and I kind of go through why we think that might be. But I think one of the things that's really important about this is that the way that the Supreme Court has talked about the Second Amendment is in a specific type of self-defense, right? It's grounded in self-defense, but it's really stranger danger self-defense, right? And the reason that this is the case, right, women really tend to bear this out. If you look at domestic violence, right, women that shoot their abusers are more likely to be found guilty, right, and not justified in their shooting, and they're more likely to be sentenced to longer terms. And it's often these sort of reasons like, well, why did you leave? Why did you shoot them when they were sleeping? Why did you shoot them when they were in a prone position, or you weren't in the midst of an argument, right? And so they don't actually have the same kind of Second Amendment right to armed self-defense against, right, their greatest threat, because women are much more likely to be harmed by somebody they know than a stranger. Right? Meanwhile, Bruin, the case before Rahimi, expanded the Second Amendment right to carry firearms out in public. And so if you look at firearms in public with states that have stand your ground laws, right? So they say you don't have to retreat if you feel threatened. You can shoot somebody. And if the person shooting is white and the person they shoot and kill is black, they are 4 times more likely to be seen as justified than if those roles are reversed, right? So in the same circumstance, right, black people don't have the right actually to the same kind of self-defense that white men do, right? And so then if you go to, you know, through an intersectional lens, right, the story of Marissa Alexander, which a lot of people probably know, demonstrates, right, you have a black woman who's in her home, her ex comes there, threatens her, refuses to leave, she gets her legally owned firearm, shoots it, a warning shot into the ceiling, he calls the police arrest her, she's sentenced to 20 years in prison. She ends up getting out, but still, she spent a lot of time in prison, right? It's the specific example that is often used for justifying an expansive view of the Second Amendment, and at the same time, it doesn't actually work, right? And so, you know, this is important because as the right gets expanded out into public spaces and potentially with more and more weapons, right? If you look at other research and we think about who is able to do this and who's not, you know, young black males, for example, are seen as bigger, stronger, more likely or able to commit physical harm, more likely to be criminals, right, than a white person that is exactly the same size, right? And so that matters both in terms of who are what the public would deem potentially viable threats, but it also then plays a role at every other step after that, right? So the ability to get even retroactive justice becomes difficult because, right, the police are more likely to say, oh, I also see this as a threat. I can understand why you would, you know, stand your ground, for example, right? Prosecutors and prosecutorial discretion, right? Juries, all of these levels are going to use things in the criminal system, right? Reasonableness, fear, that automatically include implicit biases to make it much, much more difficult to achieve justice. And so the thing that I think about a lot is, you know, guns are a source of power, right? And they can be powerful in use, but also not even in use, right? Just knowing that a gun is present, this happens a lot in domestic violence cases, but even in terms of, you know, community violence. And I think this is important because the Second Amendment is a way to maintain social hierarchies, right? And this has always been true. So there's a quote: there's no reason why on the street today a citizen should be carrying loaded weapons. Anybody have a guess as to who said that? It was Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California, when the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense went armed into the state capitol, right? And then he signed a law that said you can't have loaded weapons in public, right? And so Black self-defense has always been vilified and criminalized, right? And so the way that gun rights and Second Amendment rights have been viewed can ultimately be tied historically to how much are Black people able to access them or unable to access them, right? As you have sort of, you're coming out of, you know, the quote unquote crack epidemic and, you know, the war on drugs and increased carceral state, right, is the time where you have this expansive view of Second Amendment as, you know, a lot of weapons and firearms are being concentrated in a smaller group of people, largely white men. And so, you know, that is an important aspect of thinking about the Second Amendment and how it is used. The other thing is that the Supreme Court, after Bruin, said that history is really the way that we need to be thinking about the Second Amendment and what laws are constitutional and which ones aren't. And so here what you have is, you know, history being used, right, especially racist history, right? Like I said, the disarmament of Black people is used to say we need to expand Second Amendment rights. At the same time, in other areas of constitutional law, the court is saying racist history is not impacting things today, right? So if you think about SFFA, Voting Rights Act cases, right, they're like, don't look back, that stuff doesn't matter, it's over, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And then in Second Amendment cases, they're like, look, we don't want this thing to happen again, and it could, and so we really need to be vigilant about protecting these kinds of rights. And so looking back to the past, I think, has done a lot to sort of obscure current subjugation, right? So again, during Rahimi, there was all this talk of, well, this is a perfect case to show why history is a problem, right? We're using history when women were property and they didn't have rights, and that's true, right? But Reva Siegel talks about this in at least one of her papers, right? But by doing that, you're sort of inherently saying, and look how great things are now, right? And so it's the same thing with, look, there was this time in this era where black people, they could just go around and take all their guns away. Thank God we're not in that state anymore, right? And again, this sort of like, you know, generic, everybody now has access to Second Amendment rights is the way that they use that. And so, you know, thinking about rights on paper versus rights in reality, you know, I started thinking about it's really about power and privilege that determine who can exercise these rights, these Second Amendment rights, which of course, right, is influenced by the reproductive justice movement, right? And really a big part of that movement was not just can you get an abortion or can't you get an abortion, right? But having a more expansive view of reproductive health care. And I think it's the same thing here, right? So when we're thinking about what I've at least a couple times called firearms justice framework, right? We need to take a more expansive view of, you know, what is gun violence, right? It is people being shot and killed. It is also people committing suicide. It's also people being shot and surviving. It's also, you know, neighborhoods, right? People that live in dangerous neighborhoods that are over-policed, right? Because they are a quote-unquote violent area or a hotspot, but also under-policed because they're not actually solving the crimes that are happening in these spaces, right? And so, you know, one of the other things that I really sort of has stuck with me when thinking about Second Amendment and connections to reproductive justice is the way that government policies and court decisions create the conditions under which people live and then pretend like they don't have an impact, right? So Harris v. McRae is a 1980 Medicaid case about whether abortion has to be covered in Medicaid, and they say no. But in part, they say, although government may not place obstacles in the path of a woman's exercise of her freedom of choice, it need not remove those not of its own creation. Indigency falls in the latter, right? So they're literally saying, these people are poor and the government has nothing to do with that at all, right? If you think about things like how often Chicago is brought up, right? And these sort of, you know, use of terms like thugs, right? As if nothing that the government does, nothing that these court decisions do, they have no impact on who lives in violent, dangerous neighborhoods and who doesn't. And so one of the things that is great is this emerging research on redlining, which you know is important in terms of housing, but looking at redlining and overlaps with things like, I have to look because this is certainly not my area, but subprime mortgage lending, right? And what it is trying to show is that really we need a more intersectional look at structures, right? When we're talking about them. Redlining is not just about housing, it's about creating people of color in one area and white people in a different area. That then also makes it easier for both predators, right, to say, here's where we're gonna go for our subprime mortgage lending, but it also makes it easier in terms of policies, right, to say, here's where we're gonna send police because it's dangerous there, right? That's logical, right? But then it also means people are not gonna go to that area because it's dangerous, right? So that means economic hardship. It means that there is gonna be, those people have to leave, right, to go and get jobs because there's gonna be less investment in those communities. So then they're working in other people's neighborhoods, right, to sort of stimulate the economy in those areas. So we need to have a more expansive view, right? Things like, community interventions, minimum wage increases, Medicaid expansion, universal health care, child care, equitable pay for women, right? All of these things are gun safety measures, and I think, the reproductive justice movement is something that's really taught me that. And so I'll just end with one quote. Loretta Ross, one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement, said, if you're starting at the pregnancy, you're starting at the wrong place. And I think for such a long time, in terms of gun violence, we've been starting at somebody being shot and killed, and that's really the wrong place to be starting. So, thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions. I am just buzzing with thoughts about the various papers, because although the substantive topics were quite different, obviously the through line in terms of carcerality has generated a lot of really interesting, I think, connections, as well as really interesting divergence that we can dive into. But before I ask my questions, I'd like to open it up to you all. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so, excuse me. Thank you so much for all of the talks. I agree with Priscilla. There are interesting ones, and I was trying to think of, is there a question that I can ask that all of you can answer simultaneously? I was struck by Raymond's final thoughts about abolishing carceral mentalities. Right? That these are issues that seem to ring across all of the talks. Neal, you talked about taking seriously the existence that we need to take seriously the intersections between all different movements in order to deal with the animal rights framework through carcerality. And I couldn't help but think, you talked about customary practice exceptions, and I couldn't think about mirror images in Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, in the sense that these are both informed by how do we societally accept the types of punishments that we mete out. And these seem to inform what is allowable under our practices. Right? And so, to the extent that you're trying to attack that in the animal rights realm, I wonder why you would think it would be more successful if we see in our carceral institutions the willingness to mete this out on people whose humanity is human, is embodied as human. The sentient being is a human who you're punishing with this type of force and brutality. How do we convince people that don't care about that realm to then care, more about the carceral lives of animals, for example? So I guess I have a long list of questions. So I'll start with just you, Neal, and other people can ask them.
Yeah, I think most of this presentation is, I guess, centered around people who do generally care for the well-being of people as well. I think that's kind of some of the baseline. I mean, some people, to be fair, don't care a lot about animals, and then don't care about people, don't care about Black people, don't care about whatever marginalized group. But I think the starting point is just this basic idea of sentience and empathy and understanding. And so getting people there on any front is, I think, can be difficult. But I'm not trying to, I guess, I'm not trying to have it be one or the other. I think they have to be connected. I think that if you do care about human rights issues, racial justice issues, that you do also have to care about animal rights issues, and vice versa. So I guess I'm trying to think of it more as unable to be disconnected. So if you are caring about these issues, then you should be thinking about this as well.
Other questions? All right, then I'll jump right in. So, there are a couple of some groupings that I want to put on the table. Neala, Michael, and to some extent, to a significant extent, Frank, you all talked about specific, historical moments with respect to the gun rights movement or hotspot policing, or Neala, you talked about the criminalization of animal rights protests. And each of these seems to me to be testing grounds, right, for specific forms of state intervention, criminalization, and suppression at subsequent moments. And so I'm wondering how we can think about this idea of how we pay attention to testing grounds. And I'm thinking about it also in terms of this historical moment that we're in now. We're seeing a lot of cities being used as laboratories of repression and criminalization and as testing grounds. And so I'm wondering if you can looking back on these historical moments that you highlighted, particularly Niala, Frank, and Michael, is there anything that we can learn about the state's approach to criminalization, carcerality, or regulation, for example, of guns, that might be useful theoretically as we think through contemporary moments of testing grounds? Okay, nobody wants to answer my question.
We're trying to be deferential to each other. Go ahead.
I'm a rabble rouser. I was a labor organizer, so I'll jump in.
Yes,
so sorry to jump in, actually. I think your question actually reminded me a lot of the plenary about the comments about settler colonialism and transnational critical race theory. Because I do think, in terms of testing ground, the way that we criminalize in the United States actually has so much to do with it. The tactics that the United States has been using has been tested abroad. The tactics that to mess with elections here have been tested abroad, in previous colonies, in previous territories, right? And so I think if we're trying to think about what practices have been successful in oppressing people here, our analysis also have to begin where they have been tested abroad. Particularly I'm thinking about the Philippines, for example, during when it was still a colony, and how the United States have been using, what's the word, surveillance practices, even back then have been being tested on those lands. Of course, I'm also thinking about Puerto Rico, right, as testing grounds for literal things like that. And so I think I'll just chime in with that as a kind of like start jumping point.
I'll go ahead. So I think there's two things. One is I think we always need to be seeing things through that lens, right, and taking it seriously that it can always be expanded. Right, I mean, there's so many different examples. The one that just pops in my head is Dobbs, right? I'm at BU, I'm in Massachusetts. I've, be asked to go to these community groups, and I'm like, thank God we live in Massachusetts. It's like, well, I could just come up with a way right now that, they could expand it nationally, and it's just whether or not they can get 5 justices on the Supreme Court to agree with it, right? The other thing is that they reuse, strategies all the time. Right? I mean, part of what I forgot to say was, right, Harris v. McRae is also linked then to Ferguson versus City of Charleston, right? Where you're creating an environment that allows you to then go and target pregnant women who might have a drug problem. It just so happens that all the ones that were targeted were Black women, right? McDonald v. Chicago is linked to, the use of Chicago as this sort of like crime-ridden, gun-addled state. And so, I think we need to be looking back to see what are other, ways that they strategize to oppress and to take away rights and to target people, and then how could that potentially be used today?
I can jump off from there. So one interesting thing about that Ferguson case is that it's like 28 or 29 Black women and 1 white woman who was with a Black man.
Yeah, it's noted
right?
in her medical record. Yes, yeah. 29 of 30 were Black, and the 1 white woman had a Black boyfriend.
And so part of what we have to do is think about, everybody knows this, right? We have to show ways that this is the tip of the spear and they're coming for you next, right? Like that the association with Blackness is always problematic, and it might show people that we're the miner's canary, right? I'm thinking about Raymond's presentation and this idea of coloniality of power that Ramon Grossvogel and others talk about, which is the idea that historically in the United States, or in New York City specifically, they do a study. African Americans obviously are, denigrated. Then in come Puerto Ricans, they get African Americanized, so they get mistreated. In come Dominicans, they get Puerto Ricanized, so they get mistreated. Cubans come in, but Cubans come in with money because of the Cold War, and they get white, right? And so there's all this, like, how much do you get associated with Blackness, like the way you're saying, versus how much do you get distinguished from Blackness? I really liked your example, the last example about like, you know, the people saying like, oh, he's the darker skinned one. He's the one that likes rap. Like, see, he's like black people. We can pull him from the model minority and treat him like black people. It's a little bit of a metonymy as opposed to metaphor, but I see connections between these things.
Yeah, I think building off of that, whenever I think about these kind of testing or practice grounds, even thinking about just the narratives that do get told, I think that's kind of the fundamental through line, is how like stories are told about whatever the issue is and how we can counteract that. Because once you control the narrative, control the fear, all of that, then it becomes so much easier to test all of these things out and to increase surveillance, increase criminalization, whatever it is. So I think just the narratives are really important.
Okay, I'm going to take three questions. I'm going to put them all on the table, and we have 10 minutes. All right, put them all on the table. We have 10 minutes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you all. My question for Frank. So, yeah, this kind of chronology of the rise and fall of Broken Window series is incredibly interesting. And you had called it a veneer of reformation in which practices change, but subordination continues. And I find that really, really interesting, particularly with the 3-decade kind of chokehold that it's had on police practices, but also how it's seeped into kind of the common vernacular of how even citizens, police in their own communities think about neighborhood, about change, about value. And so I'm really curious as to what you see as the impetus for, even if it is this veneer, but this kind of facade of a paradigm shift in which it has now been perceived that broken window policing, that theory is no longer a worthy practice, and that something new at least needed to be posited, even if fundamentally it's not changing. So I guess I'm quite interested in the fall of the broken windows theory.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I joined late, but I'm just wondering if, since we were touching on history and replications of things post, did we discuss the sort of rise of police training facilities or cop cities that we're seeing across the United States? Where we see what has been going on in Atlanta. There's one that popped up in San Pablo in the Bay Area. And so there was something else that I was going to bring into this, but yeah, just the increase of militarization of, this police state that we're in. And I think this is one of the ramifications that we're seeing post the George Floyd protests, right? So we see after social movements some sort of ramification. So if you guys could touch on that.
Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, this is not the most well thought out, but it's a question for Michael Ulrich and also the whole panel. Can you talk about mass shootings as a form or feature of white supremacist violence? So basically thinking about it through the frame of white supremacy instead of through the frame of gun violence, which I've never understood because guns don't just go off by themselves. And then also address the counter narrative or the conversation around Black ownership of guns as a form of resistance to counter that.
So maybe we can start with the militarization question, since that was for everyone, and I think it I think all of your papers can speak to this issue. So I'll just maybe Michael, if I can start with you, and then go this way.
Sure. Yeah. So I was actually. I think the militarization serves a couple of purposes, right? One that I think gets talked about less is the tie between gun manufacturers and people that make things for the Department of Defense, right? And their ability to expand essentially their consumers. And it mirrors, I was just at a history and guns conference where somebody presented on post-Civil War, right? We had just made all these guns, we figured out how to make them really fast, the Civil War ends, and the gun manufacturers are like, shit, well now the government's not gonna buy all of our guns, and then the government was like, we have all these extra guns, so we need to sell them. And so then the thing was tied to the first sort of rise in youth gun violence, because they started selling them to kids, because it was the same time that child labor really was taking off. And so I think one, it's straight capitalism, but also creates the ability to say this is safety, right? You can sell it to the public as this is a way to protect you from, these kind of monsters that are out there.
Yeah, and just to kind of, as Frank answers the question, I think part of the way I heard your question is, the policing, suppression, criminalization of the cop city movement, anti-cop city movement. I want to connect it back to my question, which is that it was a testing ground, because the same tactics that were used in Atlanta are being utilized across the country, right? And they're being justified by, we need to tamp down in this particular place because now Los Angeles is itself a hot spot, right? Chicago itself is a hot spot. San Francisco, right now it's the state is a hot spot, right? So I'm wondering, Frank, if you could talk about it in that vein in terms of how this idea of hot spots is justifying this vast militarization of our communities.
That's a great question, and I'll try and connect it to the other questions. So to start with the first question, I'm thinking they're embarrassed by the racial and ethnic targeting. Not so embarrassed that they're not going to stick to hierarchy, but they're embarrassed by it, so they need to have this transformation in order, but that preserves the hierarchy, right? So that's kind of why I think it goes on, that there's this like, oh no, it's not the old racial profiling, it's hotspots policing. I was thinking then definitely about the LA as a testing ground right now, and that does sort of mirror the way cop cities get put together to train and test theories, and then as Priscilla says, those tactics get used in other places. I think that's definitely true. But note what gets skipped over, right? The question about mass shootings, right? Mass shootings are a white male thing, right? Nobody is testing like what we should do with that. Why? I think that ends us back with racial capitalism, right? That this is about how money flows through race. And if we were to say like, oh, we have to go target the white males, right? What we're saying, is usually the children of the people who own the country, which means they're the people who should run the country, are going to be affected by what we do. And, when is that gonna happen? Never.
I would also just add to that, I think part of it is I actually think to some extent mass shootings are beneficial in a way that you can, highlight these people are crazy, right? They have some mental illness, and that's why this thing is happening, and so they're so rare and unique and whatever, right? Versus, again, in communities of color, they're thugs, they're criminals, they are drug addicts, right? They are dangerous people. And so I think mass shootings are often used as a way then to distinguish between people that are committing violence, to say, here are these sort of outliers that have some mental problem that makes them different from the rest of us white people, so don't take our guns. But then over here, right, they're all problems, right? And so you can target them, through hotspots and other interventions.
Violence for no reason versus violence because you're a bad culture.
Right, yeah.
Right, which goes back to the cultural thing that Raymond was saying. But,
I don't think I have too much to add in terms of the cop cities, except that some of the research I was doing, it was interesting to see when there are more police presence, it's not obviously just humans who are impacted, and the number of police that will go into homes and shoot people's dogs, even when they're not attacking, they're not doing anything, and it's completely loud, there's no real repercussions for that. So that's just one thing I noticed as there's been increased police presence, more reports of that happening.
And I know we are just out of time, but Neil, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the suppression of animal rights movements, because that's where in that question, where I saw the most similarities in terms of labeling entire movements as terroristic, right? And I'm wondering, is there anything that we can learn from, if this is an area that you're familiar with, about how the animal rights movement has responded to that kind of just systematic criminalization of their protests?
Yeah, I do think a lot of that is what has shifted the movement away from targeting some of these larger corporations and factory farms, because of the power that they hold in dictating how animal rights activists are targeted. Because if animal rights activists are focused solely kind of on the companion animals, that's not really seen as changing, or it's not threatening to anybody. It's not threatening to the status quo. And I think in part because of the criminalization, even right now, there's a case going on in Northern California of someone who rescued basically just like a dying chicken from a farm who's facing I don't know how many years in prison for it. So yeah, I think the animal rights movement has shifted because of that. So I don't think they've responded well, basically. I don't think they've responded well to it.
So nothing to learn.
They haven't pushed back.
No, but I think also it's with the point that, so I'm just going to say this and then we're out of time, is that when corporate power is threatened by protest movements, they leverage the power of government to suppress it through criminalization, right? And that is precisely what we saw with Cop City, right? And we're seeing that across the country, particularly after the uprisings in 2020, right? That's where, there were clear movements that were calling for the dismantling of corporate power that are now the targets of this administration. So anyway, this was a really wonderful conversation. Please give our panelists